guys, in this video we'll be looking at liberalization, privatization and globalization. Okay, that is LPG reforms. So through this chapter we'll be able to understand the background of the reform policies introduced in India in 1991, understand the mechanism through which reform policies are introduced, comprehend the process of globalization and its implications in India, and be aware of the impact of the reform process in various sectors. Okay, so thing that happened is that in 1991, India met with an economic crisis, okay, related to the external debt. The government was not able to make repayments on its borrowings from abroad. Okay, we were taking money from other countries for our own expenditure. Okay, foreign exchange reserves, forex reserves, which we generally maintain to import petroleum and other important items, dropped to the levels that were not sufficient for even a fortnight, that is even for 2 weeks. The crisis was further compounded by the rising prices of essential goods. All this led to the government to introduce a new set of reforms, policy measures that changed the direction of our development strategies. Okay, now origin of the financial crisis can be traced to the inefficient management of the Indian economy in the 1980s. We know that from implementing various policies in the general administration. So in the previous lecture we have seen about about the mixed economic policies that the government introduced, especially the license Raj and tariffs on exports, and all these things were done by the government. Okay, and mainly there was no proper development from the private sector category for the country's GDP. Okay, the government generates funds from various sources such as taxation, running of public sector enterprises. When expenditure is more than the income, the government borrows finance the deficit from banks and also from people within the country and international financial institutions. Okay, development policies require that even though revenues were low, the government had to overshoot revenue to meet challenges like unemployment. All these social aspects, had to be met with the same revenue that the government got from taxes and other indirect ways. Okay, when government was spending a large share of its income on areas which do not provide immediate returns, such as social sector and defense, there was a need to utilize the rest of its revenue in a highly efficient manner. See, in social reforms or in providing subsidies, all these things, there is no returns in an actual manner. Or in defense, it is like even if you are going for a war, it is a dead expense, because there is a lot of it's a huge liability for the government. Okay, and the income from the public sector undertaking was not very high to meet the growing expenditure. Okay, at times of foreign exchange borrowed from other countries, international financial institutions, was spent on meeting the consumption demands only. Okay, so what happened? Neither was an attempt made to reduce such profligate spending, nor sufficient attention was given to boost the exports to pay the growing demands. These was left unchecked. Okay, so in 1980s, the government expenditure began to exceed its revenue by such large margins that meeting expenditure through borrowings became unsustainable, that we were not even able to pay the interest with the revenue that we generated. Okay, India then approached the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, okay, popularly known as the World Bank, and the IMF, that is International Monetary Fund, and received a 7 billion loan to manage the crisis. For availing the loan, these international agencies expected India to liberalize and open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector. So in the early chapters we have read, India was actually planning on self-reliance. Okay, it restricted to a large extent, it restricted foreign companies to perform in India. Okay, and there was no competition. So without competition, the domestic market also lagged behind. So India agreed to the conditionalities of World Bank and IMF and announced the new economic policy. The economic policy consisted of wide-ranging economic reforms. The thrust of the policies was towards creating a more competitive environment in the economy and removing the barriers to entry and growth of firms. This set of policies can broadly be classified into two groups. What? The stabilization measures and the structural reform measures. Stabilization measures means are short-term measures intended to correct some of the weaknesses that have developed in the balance of payments and to bring inflation under control. In simple words, this means that there was a need to maintain sufficient foreign exchange reserves and keep rising prices under control. On the other hand, structural reform policies are long-term measures, aimed at improving the efficiency of the economy and increasing its international competitiveness by removing the rigidness in various segments of the Indian economy. The government initiated a variety of policies which fall under three heads. That is what liberalization, privatization, and globalization. So first we'll be looking at the largest part, the liberalization. As pointed out in the beginning, rules and laws were aimed at regulating the economic activities. So there were a lot of restrictions. So a few liberalization measures were introduced in 1980s in areas of industrial licensing. Earlier, licensing was a restricted measure in which uh, there was kind of like a monopoly of the existing industries that didn't allow the new industries to come up. Then export import policy, technology upgradation, fiscal policy, and foreign investments, all this had some kind of liberalization. And also, let's just study some important areas which such as the industrial sector, financial sector, tax reforms, foreign exchange markets, and trade investment sectors, which received great attention after 1991. So, first we'll be looking at industrial sector. In India, regulatory mechanisms were enforced in various ways. Industrial licensing, as we have discussed earlier, under which every entrepreneur had to get permission from government officials to start a firm, close a firm, and to decide the amount of goods that could be produced. Everything was checked by the government. Private sector was not allowed in many industries. For example, natural resources extraction, defense, telecommunication, all these areas, private sector was not allowed. And some goods could be produced in small scale industries. Control on price fixation and distribution of selected industrial products was also there. So, reform policies introduced in and after 1991 removed many of these restrictions. Industrial licensing was abolished for almost all the products except for some sin goods like alcohol, cigarettes, all these things. The licensing was needed. The only industry which are now reserved to the public sector was defense equipment, atomic energy generation, and railway transport. Many goods produced by the small scale industries have now been de-reserved. In many industries, the market have been allowed to determine the prices. Financial sector reforms. So we have looked at industry. Now we will look at the financial sector reforms. Financial sector includes financial institutions such as commercial banks, investment banks, stock exchange, operations, and foreign exchange market. The financial sector in India is regulated by the RBI, that is Reserve Bank of India. You may be aware of all banks and other financial institutions in India are regulated through various norms and regulations of the RBI. So RBI is the sole control or sole head of financial reform. One major aim of the financial sector reform was to reduce the role of RBI from regulator to facilitator to financial sector. This means that the financial sector may be allowed to take decisions in many matters without consulting RBI. The reform policies led to the establishment of private sector banks, Indian as well as foreign. Foreign investment limit in banks was raised around how much? 74%. Those banks which fulfill certain conditions have been given freedom to set up new branches without the approval of RBI. So this means that previously there was a consultation from RBI was needed to set up new branches, and rationalize their existing branch networks. Though banks have been given permission to generate resources from India and abroad, certain managerial aspects have been retained with the RBI to safeguard the interests of the account holders and the nation. So, foreign financial institution or foreign institutional investors such as merchant bankers, mutual funds, and pension funds are now allowed to invest in Indian financial markets. And tax reforms. Tax reforms are concerned with the reforms in the government taxation and public expenditure policies, which collectively known as fiscal policy. There are two types of taxes, direct and indirect. For this direct taxes, we can say direct consisted of the individual income of a person, as well as profits of business enterprises. Since 1991, there has been a continuous reduction in taxes on individual incomes, as it felt that higher rates of income tax were an important reason for tax evasion. People, it was like 30-40%. If the tax is 30-40% of the profit, what happens? The people naturally they won't feel like giving tax to the government. So it is now widely accepted that moderate rates of income tax encourage savings and voluntary disclosure of income. The rate of corporation tax, which was very high earlier, had been gradually reduced. Efforts have been made to reform the indirect taxes levied on commodities. Indirect taxes means our GST, all these things. Okay, on products. Okay, in 2016, the Indian Parliament passed a law, Goods and Services Tax (GST) Act of 2016, to simplify and introduce a unified indirect tax system in India. This law came into effect from July 2017. This is introduced in 2016 and came into effect in July 2017. Is expected to generate additional revenue from the government, reduce tax evasion, and create one nation, one tax, and one market. Okay, another component of the reform of this area is simplification. In order to encourage better compliance on the part of taxpayers, many procedures have been simplified and the rates also substantially lowered. Foreign exchange reforms. The first important reform in the external sector was made in the foreign exchange market. Okay, so earlier, as an immediate measure to resolve the balance of the payment crisis, the rupee was devalued against foreign currencies. This led to an increase in the inflow of foreign exchange. It also set the tone to free the determination of rupee value in the foreign exchange market from government control. Okay. Now, more often than not, markets determine exchange rates based on demand and supply. So, rupee's value was determined by demand and supply in the market rather than government control. Okay. Trade and investment policy reforms. Liberalization of trade and investment regime was initiated to increase international competitiveness of industrial production and also foreign investments and technology into the economy. The aim was also to promote efficiency of local industries and adoption of modern technologies. Okay, and in India was following a regime of quantitative restrictions on imports. Okay, it was like if things can be produced in India, then the less quantity of the same item will be imported here. There will be various certain amounts will be imported, and the rest will be made by the Indian company. That was the case. Okay, and by keeping the tariffs very high, these policies reduced efficiency and competitiveness, which led to slow growth in the manufacturing sector. Trade policy reforms aimed at dismantling the quantitative restrictions on import and exports, reduction of tariff rates, and removal of licensing procedures for imports. Import licensing was abolished, except in the case of hazardous and environmentally sensitive industries. Quantitative restrictions on imports of manufactured consumer goods and agricultural products were also fully removed. Export duties have been removed to increase competitive position of Indian goods in the international market. So import restrictions were removed and export restrictions were also removed so that better quality of the products, Indian products, will be produced, looking into the global product category. Okay. And privatization. It implies shedding of the ownership or management of government owned enterprises. It is like there are two ways: by withdrawal of the government from the ownership and the management of the public sector companies, and by outright sale of public sector companies. Governments can sell the company, or they can stay away from the management of the company. Privatization of the, or give the management to a private individual. Okay, privatization of the public sector enterprises by selling off part of the equity of public sector enterprises to the public is known as disinvestment, which is happening right now. Okay. Now, government has also made attempts to improve the efficiency of the PSUs by giving them autonomy in taking managerial decisions. For instance, some PSUs have been granted special status like Maharatnas, Navaratnas, and Mini Ratnas. So, please do look into what all companies are listed in these categories. It is given over here. In this paragraph, it is given over here. Okay, do read that part. Now, globalization. Although globalization is generally understood to mean integration of the economy of the country with the world economy, it is a complex phenomenon. Okay, there are different outcomes of globalization. Okay, globalization attempts to establish links in such a way that the happenings in India can be influenced by the events happening miles away. It is turning the world into one whole, creating a borderless world. Outsourcing is in the global market. It's like if your client, if I am in America and I want a product to be made, or software to be made at a cheaper rate, I can contact a company in India which has a much lower labor charge. So I mean much lower rate, and I will contact that company and they will deliver my product at a lower rate. So that is actually outsourcing. Okay, and this led to increase in banking services, music recording, and because the world was seeing, the Indians were seeing how the world was performing, so they wanted to advance in that direction. So So, with the help of modern telecommunication links, including internet, the text, voice, and visual data in respect to these services were digitized, transmitted in real time over continents and national boundaries. Okay, and all these things, what happened? Globalization helped in uh, creating a whole new world order. Now we have the World Trade Organization. It was founded in 1995 as a successor organization for the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. Okay, GATT was established in 1948 with 23 countries as the Global Trade Organization to administer all multilateral trade agreements. Okay, by providing equal opportunities to all countries in the international market for trading purposes. Okay, WTO is expected to establish a rule-based trading regime in which nations cannot place arbitrary restrictions on trade. Okay, and protection and trade of services to ensure optimum utilization of world resources and to protect what? The environment. The WTO agreements cover trade on goods as well as services also. Okay, and and we now see what is an indication of a developed country. Okay, now we will see Indian economy during the reforms and an assessment. Okay, the reform process has completed 3 decades since its introduction. Let us look how the performance of the Indian economy during the period. Okay, in economics, the growth of an economy is measured by the gross domestic product. Okay, post 1991, India witnessed a rapid growth in GDP in a continual basis for 2 decades. The growth of GDP increased from 5.6% during 1980 to 1991 to 8.2% in 2007 to 2012. During the reform period, the growth of agriculture declined while the industrial sector reported fluctuation. The growth of the service sector was gone up. This indicates that this growth is mainly driven by the growth in the service sector. Okay, and during 2012 to 2015, there has been a setback in the growth rates different sectors witnessed post 1991. While agriculture recorded a high growth rate during 2013 to 2014, this sector witnessed negative growth in the subsequent year. Okay, and the service sector continued to witness a high level of growth. The opening of the economy has led to rapid increase in foreign direct investments. Okay, the foreign investment, which includes foreign direct investment, foreign institutional investment, has increased from about US 100 million in 1991 to about 30 billion in 2017 to 2018. As there has been an increase in the foreign exchange reserves. At 1991, it was 6 billion, and to how much? 413 billion. It is around 600 billion right now when I am talking with you. Okay, India is one of the largest foreign exchange reserve holders in the world. Okay, actually, I think it's fifth rank. Okay, India has been a successful exporter of auto parts, engineering goods, IT software, textiles in the reform period. Rising prices have also been kept under control. On the other hand, the reform process has widely criticized. Now we will see the drawbacks. See, it failed to address the basic problems facing our economy, especially in the areas of unemployment, agriculture, industry, infrastructure development, physical management, and growth and unemployment. Though GDP growth rate has increased in the reform period, scholars point out that the reform-led growth has not generated sufficient employment opportunities in the country. This will you'll okay. Uh, Now reforms in agriculture. Public investment in agriculture sector, especially in infrastructure, which includes irrigation, roads, power, all these things has fallen in the reform period. It got reduced. Further, the partial removal of fertilizer subsidy has led to the increase in the cost of production, which was severely affected. So all these affected the agriculture market. Moreover, because of the export-oriented policy strategies in agriculture, there has been a shift from protection from the domestic market towards the production of the export market, focusing on cash crops. So government began to focus more on revenue creation. So more cash crops were grown. So reforms in industry. Industrial growth also recorded a slowdown. This is because decreasing demand of industrial products due to various reasons such as cheaper imports, inadequate investment in infrastructure. In a globalized world, developing countries are compelled to open up their economies to a greater flow of goods and capital from developed countries. Okay, so here is an example for this. Here, see, moreover, a developing country like India still does not have the access to developed countries' markets because of high non-tariff barriers. barriers. For example, all quota restrictions on exports of textiles and clothing have been removed in India. USA has not removed their quota restrictions on import of textiles from where India and China. This is investment. Every year, government fixes a target for this investment in PSCs. Okay, for instance, in 1991 to 1992, target was to mobilize 2,500 crore through disinvestment. The government needed funds, so naturally they began to sell things, sell their companies. Government was able to mobilize around 3,000 crore more than the target. And in 2017 also it was target was about how much? Target was about 1 lakh crore, and whereas achievement was about 1 lakh 57 crore. Critics point out that the assets of PSUs are undervalued. And in the comment section, if you want, you can write about the negative aspect of the this investment and how it will affect in the future of the country. Okay, all these things. Reforms on fiscal policies. Economic reforms have placed limits on the growth of public expenditure, especially in social sectors. The tax reductions in the reform period aimed at yielding a larger revenue and curb tax evasion has not resulted in increase in the tax revenue. Although tax reforms were there, the revenue collected from tax was not yet on a proper scale. Okay, also the reform policies involving tariff reduction have curtailed the scope for raising revenue through custom duties. In order to attract foreign investment, tax incentives are provided to foreign investors, which further reduce the scope of rising tax revenues. Okay, all these reductions, all these subsidies were given in the economy, so the scope of getting any returns or income from these areas reduced. The process of globalization through liberalization and privatization policies has provided positive as well as negative results, both in India and other countries. Okay, globalization should be seen as an opportunity in terms of greater access to global markets. Okay, and high technology and increased possibility of large industries of developing countries to become important players in an international arena. And also, as I said earlier, this could also be a chance where the developed countries can exploit the developing countries. Okay, that is all for today's video. So I hope you guys were able to follow today's lecture. So until then, and I'll see you in the next video. So until then, goodbye. God bless you all. Jai Hind.